I'm excited to be here, and I'd like to share some things with you today that I think can make a difference. If you do, in fact, have something to take notes on, I'm going to ask you to write some things down. When you go to an experience like this, I guess one of the most frustrating things for me in church settings is we go to lots of meetings and you rarely see many notes taken. And the fact is, if you don't take notes in a meeting and then review those notes within 48 hours of that experience, your retention drops to about 25% of what you heard. And I would like to suggest to you today, I really think we can share something with you today that may make a difference. All right, let me begin by sharing this experience with you. About 6 months ago, I was approached by the U.S. Attorney in the state of Utah, Brenton Ward, and he said, we've decided to see if we can't do something about, be part of the solution instead part of the problem, the drug problem in the high schools in Utah. He said it is our perception that we have a fairly serious problem, and so as the U.S. Attorney's Office, we'd like to do something about that. And so he approached the Utah Jazz and asked if they would support. They said they would, and then he came and said, Hyrum, we're going to put together an assembly, what can we do? And so we talked about it, and I ended up being part of this assembly. Since October, we have gone to 38 or 39 high schools, a few junior high schools, and put on this 90-minute assembly. I do about 35 or 40 minutes of it, and then a member of the Utah Jazz talks, and they put together a film, a very stark, ugly film about 3 young people in Utah and the problems that they had with drugs. These 3 were found in a rehabilitation hospital in Salt Lake. One was 16, the other 2 were 17, all 3 of them serious alcoholics and drug addicts. 2 of the 3, since the movie was filmed, are still what they call dry. They have got, I think they have 19 months behind them now of being dry, of alcohol and drug. The 3rd young person in the movie didn't make it and tried to commit suicide here a couple of weeks ago because after 20 months of no alcohol, he went and got drunk and got plastered with coke and decided it wasn't worth living and tried to kill himself, and it was sort of a sad experience. But the other 2 are so far making it. And these 2 go with us to these assemblies. And they get up in front of these high schools, 1,500 young people in an auditorium, and they start their talk by saying, I'm a drug addict and an alcoholic. And then there's no problem after that of anyone listening in that assembly. And it's sort of been an interesting experience to discover the problem that we've had. I'd like to suggest to you today that I have some very strong feelings, opinions as to why we have the drug problem in the high schools in this state and in any state in the country, and I'd like to suggest some ways perhaps of dealing with that. I'm not talking about drugs per se today. I'd just like to talk today about how we feel about ourselves. Now, let me begin by sharing an experience with you that I shared with the group 2 years ago, but it's a good preface to what I'd like to do today. I had the opportunity when I went on my first mission, serving under a man who, in my opinion, is probably one of the greatest teachers that has ever walked the planet, Elder Marion D. Hanks. And we used to look forward with great anticipation going to see him teach and go to our zone conferences where he taught. At one particular zone conference, there was the usual number of missionaries in the mission home there in London. I think there were about 30. I think 4 of them were sisters. After the opening prayer and opening song, Elder Hanks got up and did something he had never done before. He said, I feel impressed to do something we have never done before. He said, I'm going to excuse all of you. He said, you're to leave the mission home. You have 30 minutes. You can go any place you want in London. You do not have to take your companion. That got our attention fast. He said, in that 30 minutes, you are to find a lesson of life from which you can teach something. Anywhere in London. Do you have any questions? Oh, wait, any questions? Room was empty. 30 minutes later, everybody came back. Everybody's pretty excited. Everybody had found something from which they could teach a lesson of life. Elder Hanks got up and he said, now, I'm not going to be able to hear from all of you, but he said, there are a couple of you I'd like to hear from. And then he pointed over to a great big elder sitting in the back of the room. Now, this elder always sat in the back of the room. And he pointed to this elder and he said, Elder, I want to hear from you first. Elder Hanks had a way of scrutinizing the front of your backbone. And this elder looked up at him, and he just went white with fear, and Elder Hanks said, yeah, you, elder, I want to hear from you first. So this elder started to stand. Now, I say started to stand because it took him a while. He was 6'8". And he stood up, and he had the biggest hands I've ever seen. Twice the size of my hands in thickness every other way. Shaking hands with this elder was an experience in pain. He stood up and he put his hands in his pockets, and this is how he started. His head was down like this, and his hands were in his pocket. He never looked at anybody when he started, and this is what he said. He said, you know, when I left here 30 minutes ago, he said, I knew I'd never find anything that would interest you. He said, I went down to the British Natural History Museum. He says, I covered that whole museum in 29 minutes. If you've ever been in the British Natural History Museum, you can't cover that thing in 3 weeks, let alone 29 minutes. He had to run full tilt to get through that museum. 29 minutes, covered the whole thing. He said, as I was walking out the side doors, I didn't find anything. As I was walking out the side door, my eye caught a glass case. He said, in this glass case was the most magnificent stuffed greyhound dog I'd ever seen. He said that dog was stuffed in a running position. He said, you know, as I stood there looking at that dog, I had a thought. And he said, you know what the thought was? Remember, he's looking like this and he's not looking at us. He said, you know what the thought was? He said, you know, if that greyhound ever got in a race with my Airedale back in Idaho. He was from a little town in Idaho, and he was obviously embarrassed about his grammar. He had the grammar from someone from a little town in Idaho. Now, I am not knocking little towns in Idaho. But he was a little uncomfortable about his grammar, and it was bothering him. And he said, if that greyhound ever got in a race with my old Airedale back in Idaho, that greyhound killed my Airedale. No way my Airedale ever keep up with that greyhound. But then he said, you know, as I stood there thinking about that race, a second thought came to me. When he said the word second thought, he stood up a little straighter. And not full straight, but he kind of came up like this, and he started to peer at us a little bit. And he said, you know what the second thought was? He said, the second thought was, but you know what? If that greyhound ever got in a work contest with my Airedale killed that greyhound. Then he got all excited about his Airedale killing that greyhound in a work contest. Then he said, you know, as I stood there thinking about that work contest, a third thought came to me. And when he said third thought, he came up to his full height. His voice got a whole lot stronger. Now he's looking at it straight on. Hands never left his pocket. He said, you know what the third thought was? He said, I'm just like that Airedale. Then he turned to his companion. He said, his companion's name was Perry Driggs. He said, you know, Driggs, you're just like that greyhound. Old Driggs looked up at him. I need to understand, Perry Driggs, before his mission, had graduated with honors from Harvard. Very articulate guy. He said, yeah, Driggs, you're smarter than I am. You have a lot more education than I have. You speak better than I do. But I'll tell you what, Driggs, I'll work you to death. And then he sat down. It's the most wonderful talk I'd ever heard. In the next 90 days, he proceeded to prove his point. He'd drag Driggs out of bed 30 minutes early every day, sit him up in his bed. You talk better than I do. Teach me to talk the way you talk. So Driggs gave him grammar lessons. Then he'd drag him out tracting an hour early every day, drag him from door to door. He'd stand him up in front of the door. You talk better than I do. You talk, I'll get you to the next door. In the next 90 days, the Greyhound and the Airedale out-baptized any 3 teams in the British mission. Finally, old Driggs called the mission home. You got to get me out of here. This kid's going to kill me. He says, I can't take it anymore. Now, the wonderful thing about that was, in that wonderful, maybe 2-minute talk, the only thing that changed was his self-worth. He discovered for the first time, you know, it's okay to be 6'8", have big hands, talk funny. I can do anything I want. I'm a son of God, for crying out loud. I can learn to do all that stuff. And the minute he started feeling okay about him, miracles started to happen in his life. Now, what I want to talk to you about today, brothers and sisters, is self-worth. If there is a group on this planet that should have a wonderful, powerful self-worth, it's the group sitting in this room. Why? You know who you are. You know where you came from. You know who your father is. We ought to have the most powerful self-worth out there. The most magnificent gift that you could give any of your children is a wonderfully powerful self-worth. then they're able to cope with anything the world throws at them. I can remember my mother and father telling me from when I was a small boy, you can do anything you want to do if you want to do it bad enough. Started to believe it. Almost killed me several times. I decided I could swim across a place called Hanauma Bay. I grew up in Hawaii, got halfway across, nearly drowned. I was treading water and I was looking out to sea, and all of a sudden I saw a fin about that high gliding through the water. I got to the other side really fast. But it's just something that I started believing. I can do anything I want if I want to do it bad enough. Now, to teach the principle of this whole thing, of how we feel about ourselves and how we can make it better, let me share with you a couple of reasons why it tends to be poor, and then I'd like to share with you today a control model. If you'll internalize this model, the impact it can have on you and your future is electric. Two big reasons why we tend to have poor self-esteem. Number one is we live with put-downs all our lives. How many in this room, by a show of hands, have ever been put down? Today. Now, I want to have an example. This gentleman right here, sitting next to the woman in black. On your feet. Tell me your name. What's your name? Troy? Where are you from, Troy? Tucson, Arizona. That's okay. Okay, Troy, I want you to give me an example of a put-down. You know, something like you might hear out in the hall or in the world. Give me an example of a put-down. If somebody's going to put somebody down, give me an example. Be careful. I'm glad you're having a hard time. Anybody want to help him? We got a hand in the back of the room. I'm balding. That's an example, right? Sit down, Troy. All right, that's a good. That was just as an example, right? Let's stand up. Stand up. Compared to him, I look like Boyd Packer, for crying out loud. Okay. All right, now, let's suppose Troy is about 10. Troy comes into the breakfast table and Mom says, Troy, did you make your bed? Oh, man, Mom, I forgot. You idiot, that's the third time this week. Are you stupid or something? Get back in there and make your bed. Do moms ever talk like that? Troy just got his first put down. Now Troy goes to school on the bus, walks in the class, teacher says, Troy, where's your lunch pail? Oh, man, I don't believe it. I left it on the bus. You dummy, that's twice this week. What are you going to have for lunch? Crayons? Troy just got his second put down. Do teachers ever talk like that? You know, when we were in Ventura, my daughter Glenna, then 12, was in a math class and raised her hand and asked a question about a problem on the board, and the response from the teacher came back, and I quote, "You idiot, we covered that yesterday." Do you know how long it took me to get her to ask another question in that class? She never did. It took her a whole semester. Scared her to death. Now Troy goes out during recess and he's playing catch with his friends, and he misses the ball. Can kids be ugly to each other? Oh yeah, you nerd, you can't even catch. He gets 47 more put-downs. What's Troy been told all day? I'm dumb. If he gets a steady enough diet of that, what's he going to be? Dumb. He'll live up to those expectations.